My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I know I often say it's an honor to welcome someone, but it is a true honor this evening. Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead. Those words, intoned many a Saturday night by comedian Chevy Chase, were, I'm sad to say, my introduction to the legacy of the Spanish Civil War. But that elliptical familiarity eventually led me to the novels of Hemingway. Well, it didn't lead me there, but eventually I ended up with Hemingway, the photographs of Robert Capa, and many years later to an invitation to our speaker this evening, Adam Hochschild. Like Hemingway and Capa, Hochschild is one of our great storytellers, and he has the accolades to prove it. His most recent book, To End All Wars, won the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, as was perhaps his best-selling and best-known book to date, King Leopold's Ghost. Among other numerous nominations and awards, Hochschild received the Theodore Roosevelt Woodrow Wilson Prize from the American Historical Association. Tonight, he joins us to discuss his latest book, Spain in Our Hearts, America in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Described in the New York Times as excellent and involving, a book made intimate and moving as the author follows the paths of a handful of American and occasionally English volunteers, as well as journalists, and tells the larger story of the war through their tribulations. Please welcome Adam Hochschild.
Good to have a chance to tell you about my latest book, which is about the Spanish Civil War. But to set the context for that war, let's mentally roll the clock back to the 1930s. Here at home, it was a pretty grim time. We had the Great Depression taking a terrible toll. Abroad, particularly in Europe, people were enduring the same kind of economic hardships and suffering, but in Europe especially, the Depression was fueling some very nasty movements. In Germany, Hitler was rising towards power. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already been in power since the 1920s. And furthermore, something that we often forget is that throughout almost all of Eastern Europe, there were in power in the 1930s regimes of the far right, semi-fascist, almost always with a strong anti-Semitic tinge. As the French writer André Malraux put it at the time, fascism has spread its great black wings over Europe. Oddly, one of the few bright spots in Europe was Spain. In 1931, centuries of monarchy, followed by a period of military dictatorship in the 1920s, came to an end. Real elections were held for the first time, statues toppled, the king left the country, and Spain became a republic. This was something greeted when it happened in 1931, not just in Madrid, where this picture was taken, but really everywhere, because democracy seemed to have arrived at last in a country that over the centuries had had very, very little of it. One of the big losers in this change of Spain becoming a republic was the Catholic Church, which had previously controlled all education in the country. There still remained huge problems. Spain was a country with enormous disparities of wealth, a very small, wealthy elite at the very top, a large mass of miserably poor peasantry at the bottom, millions of people living in dirt-floored huts with little or no land. And more than a quarter of the population of Spain was illiterate, by far the highest percentage of any major country in Western Europe. In early 1936, progressives and small d Democrats around the world felt a further surge of optimism when in the Spanish Republic's elections early that year, when those elections were won by a coalition of left and liberal parties. It seemed now that the people had spoken, they wanted more social and economic reforms, and there was much that could be done. Then in July of that year, shockwaves were felt around the world when a large group of right-wing army officers rose up in revolt against the elected government of the Spanish Republic. They quickly came under the leadership of a tough-talking young general named Francisco Franco, and the Spanish Civil War had begun. This was by far the largest armed conflict seen in Europe since the end of World War I, almost 20 years earlier. These right-wing army officers called themselves nationalists. They were determined to overthrow the government of the Republic. And what did they want? They wanted an end to democracy. They wanted a Spain based on the large estates in the countryside. They wanted to roll back what little land reform had been done under the Republic. They wanted the army to be supreme. They made no bones about it. This was to be a military dictatorship. There would be no free press, no free trade unions, no trappings of democracy of any kind. And they wanted to restore power to the Catholic Church, hand education back to the church. The Catholic hierarchy in Spain, by far the most reactionary in Europe, backed General Franco and his nationalists wholeheartedly, and you can find a lot of pictures like this of bishops and cardinals raising their right hands in that fascist salute. Someone else who backed Franco and the nationalists wholeheartedly was Adolf Hitler. There was widespread horror felt throughout the world that Hitler now had a new ally, and he began sending help to Franco almost immediately. Arms, military advisors, ammunition, tanks and the crews to run them, military aircraft and pilots to fly them, endless military supplies of all kinds. Now, for Hitler, the Spanish Civil War was not just a chance to help a sympathetic dictator get into power, but also to try out the weapons that he was building for the much larger war that he was already planning at that point in 1936 and would launch 3 years later. All of the major German weapons that we remember from World War II were first tried out in combat in Spain. The Messerschmitt 109 fighter plane, for example, mainstay of the Luftwaffe during World War II, in combat for the first time in Spain. Same thing with the Stuka dive bomber. From Italy, Mussolini sent not only arms, ammunition, military supplies of all kinds, but 80,000 ground troops as well, who fought on the side of Franco and the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. In the first week or two, the nationalist rebels seized about a third of Spain, the areas that are colored gray on the map here. This is how things looked at the end of July 1936, 2 weeks into the revolt. By 3 or 4 months later, however, they had gained ground and held roughly half the country. And as you can see, that gray area comes right up to the outskirts of Madrid. The army of the Spanish Republic fought on, but was extremely badly equipped. While Hitler and Mussolini were sending supplies of all kinds to the other side, the Republic was unable to get arms anywhere. You can see in this photo the soldiers don't even have helmets. That artillery piece in the background is so ancient it doesn't even have rubber-tired wheels. The Spanish Republic pleaded desperately with the world's major democracies, Britain, France, the United States, for the right to buy arms. And the Republic had the money to buy those arms because Spain, fortunately, had remained neutral during the First World War and had had an economic boom trading with both sides, while all the other major countries in Europe spent themselves deep into debt. So they had the money to buy arms, but all the democracies said no. They did not want to get drawn into a new war in Europe. Here in the United States, for example, President Roosevelt was certainly somebody who hated fascism and increasingly worried about it, but he was a shrewd politician. He knew that isolationist sentiment ran very deep in the United States and that most of the American public had no appetite for getting involved in any way in a European war. It's also widely believed that prior to running for re-election in the fall of 1936, Roosevelt promised the hierarchy of the American Catholic Church that he would not intervene in any way in Spain. For obvious reasons on both sides, this was a promise that was never written down, but everybody believes that it was made. So he said no as well to the Republic's request to buy arms. And finally, the only major country that was finally willing to sell arms to the Republic was not a democracy. It was Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. And in return for these arms sales, Stalin demanded a lot. In particular, high positions for Spanish and Soviet communists in the Republican Army's high command and in the security forces. But he not only did sell the Republic crucial arms, especially aircraft and tanks, but perhaps more important, Stalin passed the word to the world's communist parties to begin recruiting volunteers to fight in Spain. These were the forces that became the famous international brigades, some 35 to 40,000 men from more than 50 countries who went to Spain to fight for the Republic. They arrived just in time. Here are some international brigade soldiers fighting in the battle to defend Madrid in the fall of 1936. We don't know where the men in this picture came from, what countries they came from, but most likely it was from Britain, France, or Poland, which were the places that got the largest numbers of soldiers there first. At that time, in the fall of 1936, and indeed for most of the war, the front line between the nationalist and Republican forces ran right through the campus of the university that was and still is on the northwest side of Madrid. And these men are defending the university's philosophy and letters building. And if you look carefully under the row of sandbags at the left, you can see piles of books. British volunteers discovered that if you placed a book face out to oncoming fire, a bullet would penetrate about 350 pages before it stopped. So that's one argument for writing thick books. Among those volunteers were 2,800 Americans, by far the largest group of Americans ever to fight in somebody else's civil war. Here are some of the first of them arriving in Barcelona in 1937, early 1937. Incidentally, the first American casualty in the battle for Madrid was a student from Swarthmore College, not far from here. The volunteers, the American volunteers who survived the war, out of those 2,800 Americans, are all dead now. In fact, the last known surviving volunteer died in March in California at the age of 100. But one of the things that made me interested in writing about this period is that I knew a half a dozen of them. All of them men 30 or 40 years older than me, all of them gone now. But a couple of them I knew quite well for many years, and I used to hear their stories about fighting in Spain, and it was one of the things that first drew me to this period and made me curious about it. The American volunteers came from 46 of what was then 48 states. Most, though by no means all of them, were members or sympathizers of the Communist Party. They came from every conceivable walk of life. The son of a former governor of Ohio, the son of a former mayor of Los Angeles, a vaudeville acrobat, teachers, lumberjacks, longshoremen. Why did they go? Above all, I think because they had a sense that the greatest danger that all countries in the world faced at that point was a rapidly expanding fascism that sooner or later would threaten everybody. One American volunteer, Maury Kolau from New York, after he returned, said, "For us, it wasn't Franco, it was always Hitler." Another American volunteer, Hyman Katz, 23 years old, just trained as a rabbi here, wrote to his mother from Spain several months before he was killed there, saying that if he hadn't come, forever afterwards he would ask himself, why didn't I wake up when the alarm clock rang? Many of the volunteers were students. The man on the right in this photo was from Oberlin College, the other four from New York University. And those American volunteers fought in almost all the most crucial battles of the war. Of the 2,800 Americans, 750 were killed, more than 1 out of 4. Hundreds of the remainder were wounded, and that death rate is much higher than the US military suffered in either of the world wars. The American volunteers fought often in broiling heat. This photo was taken just before the Battle of the Ebro in the summer of 1938, where at one point the temperature was measured at 98 degrees in the shade, 134 in the sun. They fought another battle at Teruel in the dead of winter, where the temperature at one point was measured at 18 degrees below zero. Now, when I write history, I like to try to bring a period of time alive by focusing on the lives of a small number of people, maybe 10 or 12 people, who lived through it. And several of the people that I've zeroed in on in this book were among those American volunteers. Here are two of them, a couple, Bob and Marion Merriman. This photo was taken on their wedding day, which was the day that they graduated from college in 1932 from the University of Nevada at Reno. They had both worked their way through college there. Bob had also found time to play end on the college football team. A couple of months after graduating, they moved to Berkeley, where he became a graduate student and eventually head teaching fellow in the Department of Economics. One of his fellow students, fellow graduate students at the time who knew him well, was a young Canadian named John Kenneth Galbraith. I found myself feeling a strange sense of personal connection to the Merrimans, because when I was going through their letters, I suddenly realized that during the years that they had spent when he was a graduate student in Berkeley, they lived 3 or 4 blocks away from where I do today. And every time I walk from my house to the Graduate School of Journalism where I teach a class, I walk past the building where they used to live. Now, when Bob Merriman worked his way through college at the University of Nevada, he discovered that you could earn an extra $8.50 a month, which was a lot of money in the Depression years, by taking ROTC. So when he got to Spain 4 years later, he was one of the very few Americans who'd had any kind of military training, and was immediately made an officer, and very quickly after that, commander of the American battalion. He was wounded quite early, then he recovered from his wounds, went back into action as chief of staff of the 15th International Brigade, which was the unit that included all American, British, and Canadian volunteers, and some from other countries as well. Written about by all of the correspondents who were in Spain, seems to have been somebody with a great deal of charisma, widely admired for his bravery and his leadership qualities. His wife Marion went to Spain also, had the rank of a corporal in the Spanish Army, was the only American woman working at the International Brigade's headquarters, doing clerical work. Now, not all of the Americans who went to Spain did so as soldiers. Some were medical volunteers. The woman in the foreground in this picture, Solaria Key, was a nurse from Harlem Hospital in New York City. And at one point in Spain, she found herself in charge of a hospital ward with 5 white nurses working under her, something that never would have happened at that time in the United States. A couple of the people that I zero in on in the book were among those medical volunteers. Here's one of them, a guy named James Nugas, who was an ambulance driver, and before going to Spain had been a quite widely published poet in the United States. He kept a diary during his time in Spain, By the way, do future historians a favor and keep diaries. It's very important kind of raw material that we need to work from. Nugas was wounded in the war, but survived. Then, however, he died quite young, only about 10 years after coming home. Everybody knew he'd been keeping a diary in Spain, but everyone, including his widow, assumed it had been lost. And then, mysteriously, in 2010, just 6 years ago, a typescript of the diary was found on sale, nobody's quite sure how it got there, at a used bookstore in Vermont. And two historians, Peter Carroll and Peter Glazer, edited it for publication. I think it's perhaps the finest piece of writing by an American volunteer from this war. Another medical volunteer that I follow is a nurse named Toby Jensky, came to Spain from Beth Israel Hospital in New York. At one point, she fell in love with a wounded soldier, and it's always fascinating when you can try to reconstruct a love affair from several different angles decades later. In this case, we have letters from her. Do historians another favor and keep your letters, especially your love letters. We have a memoir by him, and we have an account from someone who knew them both in Spain who says that it didn't happen at all the way he describes in his memoir. Another type of person I got very interested in and focus in on several of them in the book are the correspondents who covered the war. Here are some of them observing and photographing a bombardment. The war was a huge news story while it was going on. During the period it raged, from mid-1936 to early 1939, there were more than 1,000 front-page headlines in the New York Times about the Spanish Civil War, more than on any other single topic. Nearly 1,000 foreign correspondents were in Spain at one time or another. One soldier wrote home to his family back here in the US, "Everybody but Shakespeare is here." Every country sent reporters. The story was really reported all over the world. Here's one group of correspondents, and of course, in the middle of it, as he always managed to be in the middle of any scene he was in, is the best known of them, Ernest Hemingway. He made 4 long trips to Spain during the war, writing articles for the North American Newspaper Alliance, a consortium of some 50 newspapers here. And with him on those trips was his then lover, later third wife, Martha Gellhorn. In this photo, she's with Bob Merriman from Berkeley, whom I was just telling you about. Now, for the correspondents, the big story was the siege of Madrid, the aerial bombing of Madrid, which went on and off for about 2 years. These are Italian aircraft bombing Madrid, bomb landing in the middle of the city. The correspondents wrote hundreds of thousands of words about this. Madrid was the city where they were based, and this was the first time that a major European capital had been under heavy, sustained aerial bombardment. Now, I've sometimes reported from abroad myself, occasionally from conflict zones. And one thing I've noticed about large groups of journalists clustered in such places is that we, tend to practice a kind of herd behavior. Reporters all too often travel in packs, pointing their camera lenses and their notebooks at the same story. And this was all the more true during the Spanish Civil War because the reporters who covered the war from the Republic's side all stayed at the same hotel, the Hotel Florida in Madrid. They ate dinner together every night in the same restaurant a couple of blocks away where there was a long table that was reserved for the foreign press. And they kept a close eye on each other and tended to report the same stories. Because as every journalist knows, the last thing that a reporter in the field wants to get is a message from his or her editor back home saying, Well, the other newspaper or the other network is reporting this or that, and why haven't we heard anything about it from you? So in situations like this where there's a certain amount of journalistic herd behavior, as there was in Spain, the question for me, looking back 80 years later, is what stories did they miss? And this enormous herd of foreign correspondents in Spain at this time missed two huge stories. One of them got a minuscule amount of coverage at the time, and one absolutely none at all. Here's the first story. In most of northeastern Spain, Barcelona, surrounding Catalonia, the nearby region of Aragon, the Franco's military coup was initially defeated not by loyal soldiers, but by militias that had been hastily organized, were badly armed, set up by left-wing political parties or trade unions. Sometimes these militias included women. And when in northeastern Spain these workers' militias defeated the nationalist grab for power, the workers suddenly found themselves in control of a large swath of the Spanish Republic. Above all, the members of these worker militias were anarchists, a tradition that was very strong in Spain, although paradoxically it had largely died out almost everywhere else in the world. For a period of 6 or 8 months, the areas that were under the sway of these worker militias carried out the most far-reaching social revolution Western Europe has ever seen. Workers took over factories. And in some cases, as with these auto workers, they converted the factory to making badly needed munitions for the front, like this homemade armored car made by auto workers in Barcelona. Auto workers in Barcelona, incidentally, took over the Ford and General Motors plants there. Railway workers took over the train system in the Northeast. These are the initials of the anarchist trade union on the side of that locomotive. Peasants took over these huge estates where they had once worked as landless laborers. In Barcelona, the city's largest and fanciest hotel was the Hotel Ritz. This is what its dining room looked like before the war. It got taken over by its cooks, waiters, and busboys, who turned it into People's Cafeteria #1 for the poor. The foreign correspondents in Spain at this time almost entirely ignored this social revolution. They seldom wrote about it. They were too busy trying to keep up with each other reporting the bombing of Madrid. So, in the book, I take you through Spain's social revolution, through the lives of 2 young Americans who found themselves in the middle of it. A couple, Lois and Charles Orr. This is the photo page from their joint passport. Lois was a student at the University of Louisville, Kentucky, her hometown. Earlier in 1936, she had married Charles Orr, who was 10 years older than she, who was an economics instructor at the university. And in the summer of 1936, they set off for their honeymoon in Europe. But they were very political. They were leftists with a very anti-Stalinist streak. And when they were in Europe and they were traveling in France and Germany, they began hearing stories about this social revolution in Spain, which, unlike the top-down revolution imposed by the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union, seemed to be a revolution that was genuinely from the bottom up. Lois, who was the live wire in this couple, insisted to her somewhat older, somewhat stodgier husband, said, "We have to go there." They hitchhiked to the Spanish border, walked across it mid-September 1936, 2 months after the war and the social revolution had begun, and for the next 10 months they lived and worked in Barcelona. And during that period, Lois wrote the most extraordinary series of letters home to her family in Kentucky. She was 19 years old. she spent much of the rest of her life writing and rewriting a memoir of this period that was never published. And together, these letters and this memoir are the most extensive account by any American, indeed probably by any foreigner, of Spain's social revolution. They met other young, independently minded left idealists who'd come from all over Europe to join this phenomenon, to see what it was like. One of them, for example, who lived in the same building that they did, was a 23-year-old political refugee from Germany named Willy Brandt. Another one of these young idealists who came there to look at what was going on became even more famous. He's here in the far left of this photo in the militia unit that he joined in Barcelona, and he is, of course, George Orwell. Some of you have probably read the memoir that he wrote about that period, Homage to Catalonia, which I think is one of the great nonfiction books of the 20th century. And unlike the foreign correspondents in Spain, Orwell, who came there both to see what was going on and to fight, did write very eloquently about this revolution that was taking place all around him. Let me just read you a few sentences from Homage to Catalonia, his description of what it was like to land in the middle of this in Barcelona. Waiters looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said senor or don. Everyone called everyone else comrade and thou. Almost my first experience was receiving a lecture from a hotel manager for trying to tip a lift boy. All this was queer and moving. I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. Okay, here's the other big story that the foreign correspondents missed. In this case, not a word about it appeared in the American daily press. A modern military runs on oil, like these tanks, which were Italian tanks that Mussolini sent to the Spanish nationalists, run on diesel fuel. Trucks and cars require gasoline. Aircraft, like this Nazi Henkel bomber over Spain, require aviation fuel. And all this time that the foreign correspondents were writing about the bombing of Madrid, they never looked up at those aircraft bombing them and asked a question: whose fuel is powering those planes? It should have been an obvious question for this reason. Nationalist Spain had no oil wells. Germany and Italy, which were heavily supplying the nationalists with arms and ammunition and other supplies, were oil importers, not exporters. Germany imported 2/3 of the oil that it used. Now, it would have been possible for Hitler and Mussolini to advance Franco money to buy oil on the world market, but it would have been hugely expensive. Moreover, if Franco were buying oil on the world market, where would he turn to buy it? Most likely the United States, which was one of the world's largest suppliers of oil at that point, especially the state of Texas. However, American neutrality legislation was very strict, and it said, even though oil was not classified as an armament, it said that not only could America not sell arms to a country at war, but that any other kind of goods, like oil, going to a country at war, could not travel on American ships. And nationalist Spain had no oil tankers. Furthermore, the US law said such goods sold to a warring country could not be sold on credit, and nationalist Spain was very short of cash. But for Generalissimo Franco, this turned out not to be a problem because he had a great admirer who was the head of a major American oil company. The man's name was Torkild Rieber, and he was the CEO of Texaco. He was a guy who liked strong men, whether Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, or much later in his life, the Shah of Iran. And then, as now, oil companies tended to make their own foreign policy. And Reber happily sold the nationalists most of their oil during the war. He sold it on credit, which was a violation of US law, and he sold it to them at a huge discount, something about which he never told Texaco shareholders. It's not mentioned in any of the company's annual reports. And as far as we can tell from the minutes of their meetings, he never even told his board of directors about this discount. Now, I mentioned that the Spanish nationalists had no oil tankers. Not a problem. Texaco, happily for Franco, had one of the world's largest fleets of ocean-going tankers. And in another violation of US law, Reber shipped Texaco oil to nationalist Spain on the company's own tankers. What would happen is that the tankers would load up at the Texaco pipeline terminal in Port Arthur, Texas. When US customs agents got on board, they would be shown paperwork showing that the ship was bound for Rotterdam, Amsterdam, or Antwerp. Then the ship would set off, and at sea the captains would open sealed orders redirecting them to ports in nationalist-held Spain. So those bombers over Madrid were fueled by Texas oil. And that's not all. Reber, the Texaco CEO, was such an enthusiast for Franco that he went to nationalist Spain twice during the war. The second time, he got a VIP tour of the front. He's second from the right in this photo. The man at the far left in the black hat, William Brewster, was head of Texaco operations in Western Europe. And Reber and Brewster put Texaco at Franco's service in another way. Being a big oil company, Texaco had, as all oil companies do, in ports all over the world, loading docks, tank farms, agents, insurers, oil installations of various kinds. And an oil company, like other kinds of companies, tends to know what its rivals are doing, especially since it's very hard to conceal something as big as an oil tanker taking on cargo. Reber and Brewster sent out word to Texaco people and representatives in ports everywhere, saying, send in immediately by telegram any information you pick up on the docks about oil tankers heading for the Spanish Republic. This information was then immediately passed on to the Spanish Nationalist High Command. During the course of the war, 29 oil tankers carrying oil to the Spanish Republic were sunk, damaged, or captured. And here's the story of one of them, which met its end thanks to information supplied by Texaco. This is a letter that William Brewster wrote to the head of the nationalist oil monopoly on July 2nd, 1937, about a tanker with a cargo bound for the Spanish Republic that was temporarily anchored off a French port near Bordeaux. The letter gives important information. In the second paragraph here, it says the tanker's name and port of registry have been painted out. Its hull and funnel have been repainted black. It's taking on food supplies, which would seem to indicate an early departure. Who's that information useful to? Nationalist submarine captains looking for targets. A separate document included with this letter gave some additional information which proved crucial, which was that most of the tanker's crew, while it was anchored off the French port, most of the tanker's crew went ashore every evening. All of this information was sent also by telegram the same day. This is the tanker, the SS Campo Amor. Immediately after receiving this information, the nationalists sent a raiding party which boarded the tanker at night when they knew most of the crew would be at shore, captured it, immediately sailed it to a port held by Franco. So the history books will tell you that the United States was neutral during the Spanish Civil War, but Texaco knew which side it was on. Well, with help like that from Texaco and of course, above all, a continued massive flow of arms and aircraft and other supplies from Hitler and Mussolini, and a large number of troops from Mussolini, Franco's nationalists advanced relentlessly. By late 1937, they held more than half of Spain, and as you can see on the map, one finger of nationalist territory, that gray on the map, comes quite close to dividing the Spanish Republic. In March of 1938, the nationalists launched the largest offensive of the war, heavily supported by German and Italian planes and tanks and lots of Italian troops, trying to drive that finger of territory towards the Mediterranean and split the Republic in two. The Republic's forces, which included the American units who took the brunt of this attack, were vastly outnumbered, overwhelmed, forced into a long, disastrous retreat, suffered tens of thousands of casualties overall. Hundreds of the Americans were killed or wounded during this retreat. And after 5 weeks of fighting, the nationalists reached the Mediterranean, and the Spanish Republic was split in two. The war would last another 10 months, but it was clear at this point that the Republic was doomed. And one effect of that was to set a huge number of people in motion as refugees, fleeing the possibility of rule by Franco. At the end, in early 1939, 500,000 Spaniards fleeing nationalist rule crossed the Pyrenees into France. And by April of 1939, the war was over, the Republic had lost, and Franco celebrated his victory in Madrid that spring and remained dictator of Spain for the rest of his life, 36 years. Now, because mine is a story about Americans in the war, I'm going to finish by coming back to the Americans who went to Spain and show you pictures of just a few of those who didn't return. Norman Lisburg, a carpenter from Louisiana, killed during that winter battle at Teruel, January 1938. James Lardner, a journalist, came from a famous literary family. His father was Ring Lardner, the humorist, the last American to enlist, and one of the last to be killed. Samuel Willis from Philadelphia, here, a laborer in the United States, a scout and runner in Spain, killed in action March 17th, 1938, on that disastrous retreat from that big nationalist offensive. Abraham Chaikin went missing in action the same day as Willis. Also during that retreat, he had been the wrestling coach at the City College of New York. And finally, Bob Merriman, whom I told you about before, who went missing in action on that same retreat a week or two later. His story sort of threads through the book, the story of him and his wife in Spain. And when I went to Spain while writing the book, I went to the place where he was last seen alive, a hilltop in the northeast near Gandesa. A lovely scene today. Looking down from this hill, you see vineyards, olive groves, red terracotta roofs on those villages in the valley. But on April 2nd, 1938, it was a grim scene. Merriman was leading a large group of the Republic's troops, Americans, Spaniards, volunteers from other countries. They reached this hilltop. They knew that they had to cross the valley and get over that range of mountains on the other side, and then they would be in territory held by the Republic. But when they reached the hilltop, they could see that the valley was already occupied by Franco's nationalists and Mussolini's troops, and that they were surrounded. They split up into smaller groups and tried to infiltrate through at night. Most of them didn't make it. And if Merriman's story seems at all familiar to you, a tall, athletic, former university instructor from the American West who loses his life in Spain, it's because Ernest Hemingway knew him well and clearly had him in mind in creating his hero, Robert Jordan, in Hemingway's novel of the war, For Whom the Bell Tolls. So I'm going to stop right here, but I would be glad to hear your comments and questions.
A friend of a friend, a good friend of a good friend of mine, who was in the Lincoln Brigade, which leads me to ask you, why were they called, how did that name come up, the Lincoln Brigade?
Okay. You know, the Lincoln Brigade was not a term used at the time. The Americans were in several different units. There was a Abraham Lincoln Battalion. Then when more people got there, they formed a George Washington Battalion. Then the two units were so badly mauled in combat, they merged them and they became the Lincoln Washington Battalion. There's also the American Medical Unit, and there was also another battalion that was ostensibly of Canadians, so it had the name of two Canadian patriots, Mackenzie Papineau, but in fact most of the people in it were Americans. When the volunteers came home, they began informally referring to themselves as being in the Lincoln Brigade, and that name stuck.
Yeah, I'd like you to comment on George Orwell's disillusionment with the Spanish Civil War.
Well, I'm not sure you could say he was disillusioned with the Spanish Civil War. In fact, I think you couldn't. You could say that he was certainly, and he describes this very eloquently in Homage to Catalonia, he was certainly extremely upset about the communist influence in the Spanish Republic, because one of the paradoxical things is that this social revolution that I described that took place in the Northeast, that was so admired in many ways by Orwell and some of the more independent-minded leftists there, was very strongly opposed by the Communist Party, which, if there was going to be any revolution, they wanted to control it, as they had in Russia. And it was also opposed by the mainstream parties of the Republic, who were no enthusiasts of revolution to begin with. And what Orwell very vividly describes in his memoir is the way that this was suppressed. There was a bout of street fighting in May of 1937, which was essentially over whether these social revolution-minded anarchists or the Republic's central government was going to control that part of Spain. And several hundred people were killed, and it was clear the revolution was at that point suppressed. The communists and the mainstream parties were anxious to suppress it because they were still desperately hoping that they would be allowed to buy arms from Britain, France, or the United States, and they knew there wouldn't be a prayer of that happening if Spain were perceived as being a revolutionary society. Orwell was deeply disillusioned by seeing this, and in particular disillusioned by how it was reported in the press, which he felt was very unfairly so, and the way Western correspondents essentially just repeated the press releases that were given to them by the Republic's government. But he never regretted having fought in Spain, and 5 years later, he wrote an essay called Looking Back on the Spanish War, where he makes that very clear. At the time that he wrote Homage to Catalonia, he felt the war had been lost because of these internal divisions within the Republic and because the revolution was suppressed. You know, if there wasn't going to be a revolution, what did people have to fight for? By 5 years later, he changed his mind on that point, and one of the things I came to admire even more in Orwell is that he's one of those rare writers who admits it when he changes his mind, changed his mind and said, we lost because of decisions made in Paris, London, Berlin, and Rome. And he should have added Washington to that list as well, essentially because Hitler and Mussolini supported the nationalists, and nobody except the Soviets stepped in to help the Republic. But he never regretted going to Spain.
How were the people who survived the war treated when they came back to this country by the government?
By the Americans, pretty badly. Many of the volunteers had their passports taken away the moment they got off the ship in New York, and for decades afterwards found themselves harassed by the FBI. They could not be accused of actually violating any US law by going to fight in Spain, but for J. Edgar Hoover and the kind of harassment that the FBI meted out to people, that was not a requirement. And for decades afterwards, anybody who was known to have fought in Spain would find, his employer would be visited twice a year by FBI agents and asked, are you aware that you're employing somebody who once fought in a communist-infiltrated army, and so on. A lot of people lost their jobs as a result of that.
Can you recommend one of the general histories written about the Spanish Civil War? Paul Preston, Hugh Thomas, those guys?
There are a couple of good ones. If you're in the mood for a long read, Hugh Thomas's History of the Spanish Civil War, which I think runs to 900 or 1,000 pages in its current edition, certainly covers the territory. A good short one is by the British scholar Paul Preston, who, to my way of thinking, is probably the best living historian in English about the Spanish Civil War, and quite a lively writer. There are, if you go to a library like this one, there are probably 25 or 30 books whose title is the Spanish Civil War, and then they have different subtitles. I think if you're in the mood for a reasonably sized book, I would start with the one by Paul Preston. Guide these folks.
Have you done any Freedom of Information Act inquiries to see what the Roosevelt administration knew about Texaco at the time?
Yeah, actually, I didn't have to use the Freedom of Information Act for that, because there's a lot of stuff in the Roosevelt papers. Usually for stuff that's that far back in time, you don't need to use the Freedom of Information Act. The Roosevelt administration did know about some of what was going on. They knew the oil was going to nationalist Spain. They knew that it was being sold on credit. And Roosevelt, although I think in many ways is one of our greatest presidents, I have to say on this issue, I hesitate to use a sort of Donald Trumpish word, but he was kind of a wimp. He didn't want to do anything that would seem to be taking sides in Spain. He summoned Reber, the Texaco CEO, to the White House in the spring of 1937 and reprimanded him for selling oil to the nationalists. The exact content of that conversation, we don't know. It was not recorded. And a cabinet meeting shortly afterwards, according to his attorney general, he declared himself in favor of vigorous prosecution. The Justice Department actually had begun preparing a case. And then, for reasons we don't know, he changed his mind. And all that Texaco got was a $22,000 fine. Roosevelt equivocated throughout the war on whether or not to help Spain. At one point, especially as the Republic seemed to be losing, he toyed with an idea of getting arms to Spain indirectly through a third country, probably in Latin America, but then dropped the idea. And then, just as the war was ending in 1939, he said to a cabinet meeting, "We made a grave mistake by not helping Spain."
There's also a lot of films that are good, movies. Ken Loach's Land and Freedom, which is very much like homage to Catalonia. But the one that I came across recently, going back to about 1970, was on the East European side. Costa Gavras' movie, The Confession, about Czech communists who were persecuted by the Stalinists in the 1950s. And the crime was that they were too closely associated with American communists in Spain. They were Spanish. It was actually held against them. So that happened on both sides of the Cold War.
It did. Stalin sent a number of military advisors to Spain more of them Eastern Europeans than Russian, Eastern European political exiles who were living in the Soviet Union at that time, but a lot of Russians as well. And he both wanted, to help the Republic's military, but at the same time, he was so paranoid that he always worried that anybody who had any exposure to anything in the West might have been subverted or secretly recruited by a Western intelligence service. So a lot of these folks, when they returned to Moscow, were given medals in a banquet and then shot a couple of days later.
I don't know if this is an aside, but I was wondering if you could talk about what happened to the Spanish refugees that went into France and what happened to them during the war and after. I know there was a group in the United States that was trying to support libertarian refugees.
There was. They had a rough time. As I say, about 500,000 Spanish Republican refugees went to France. The French were totally unprepared for them. 500,000 people pouring across their borders in the middle of winter. They were housed under horrible conditions in refugee camps, many of them set up on beaches in the south of France where it was horribly cold and wet. And there was a considerably high death rate there. The foreigners among them were in many cases able to go back to their own countries. The people who really had a rough time, though, were those who were political refugees to begin with, from Germany, Italy, and so on. They could not go back to their own countries. Other places didn't want to have them. A lot of them were still there in France. Both Spanish Republicans and some of the international volunteers who were not able to get home were still there when the Germans took over France in 1940, and at least 10,000 of them were sent to the German concentration camp in Mauthausen in Austria, and many of them worked to death there. Those who were able to get out before then went to a variety of places, probably more to Mexico than anywhere else. Mexico was very welcoming and hospitable. Chile as well.
We just had the interesting experience of reading your book while we traveled through Spain last month. So you set some context for us, although I was struck by the absence of sort of any indications of a civil war 80 years. I mean, didn't see monuments, you didn't see plaques, you didn't see statues. In reading your book, one of the things I was struck by was how brutal both sides were to each other. I mean, it was, you didn't end up well if you got captured. But generally there was a brutality to it that I'm not sure how I can compare it to other wars, but it was pretty awful. I wonder if you'd comment a little bit more about that.
Well, Spain was a country which, for many years before the war, had a high degree of political violence. Police death squads on one side, anarchists assassinating people on the other side, strikes that turned very violent. There was a big miners' strike in 1934, 2 years before the war began, where miners seized mines and buildings and so forth, and the army had to suppress it, and actually it was General Franco who led the suppression of that miners' strike, where more than 1,000 people were killed. So it was a country that had a long tradition of political violence on both sides, and when the Civil War broke out, the social tensions between rich and poor were so extreme that they were expressed in an enormous amount of violence. The best estimates on this, which come from Paul Preston, the fine historian whose work I mentioned, who wrote a mammoth book called The Spanish Holocaust, his compilation of figures, and one can do this fairly accurately now, is his totals are that during the Spanish Civil War itself, 150,000 people were massacred. These were civilians killed deliberately by the nationalists in territory they controlled, plus some 20,000 afterwards, after the war. And these were people, in many cases, whose only crime was having voted for a left-wing party or belonging to a labor union. On the Republic's side, there was also a lot of political violence, not as on the nationalist side by the order of the government, but rather by mobs which got out of control, killed people. An estimated 49,000 nationalist sympathizers or presumed sympathizers were massacred in Republican territory, most of them in the first couple of months of the war. And actually in Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, he has a very vivid description of such a massacre. So it was a very bloody business in which these social tensions that have been building up for centuries really came to a head on both sides. I think the amazing thing is that today Spain is not only a democracy, but a pretty peaceful democracy.
Several members of my family live in Spain, and when talking to them about this time period, especially my brother-in-law who grew up in Cordoba, that they, it doesn't appear like, even though it's 2016, that there's been a total resolution of the Civil War, that it's just under the surface. There's fascists just waiting to come through. That whole mentality is still there, and it hasn't disappeared, and they've never really done a reconciliation, something like a South Africa type thing in Spain. I remember seeing a documentary about digging up mass graves and still not coming to terms with that, they seem that pretty negative that Spain is as peaceful as you're describing. It's just under the surface.
Yeah, but still, it is a relatively peaceful country. But you know, these reconciliations are hard. It's one thing when it's a long time in the past, and it's true that the war began 80 years ago next month, and it ended 2.5 years after that. That was a long time ago, but Franco remained in power until his death in 1975, and Spain was a police state up until that point. You know, they were holding and torturing numbers of political prisoners. And there was a case in the news 2 years ago where a former political prisoner in Franco's Spain, a man now in his 60s, a couple of years ago saw his former torturer running in a marathon on the streets of Madrid and tried to bring a case. And this sort of raised a big issue of what do you do in a state like this when there are people who were part of such a regime who, you know, are still alive and well. Generally, their decision has been not to bring up these issues, not to prosecute people. There are a lot of individual Spaniards, though, who do care very much about putting stuff on the record, about digging up mass graves. There are excavations of mass graves in several different parts of the country. But it's hard to have that kind of reconciliation when a dictatorial regime extended to such a fairly recent point in the past.
Mr. Hochschild, how much do you believe the Republican leadership and the common people of Spain with the Republic were aware of the Russian communist terror famine in the Ukraine in the early 30s?
I believe they were probably not aware at all of it because the famine in the Ukraine and the Soviet Union at that time, which killed, they estimate today, somewhere in excess of 5 million people, was barely reported in the Western press. And the 1930s were a time where so many people were so eager to believe that there was an alternative to the terrible toll that the Great Depression was taking in the United States and in Western Europe, that they were quite happy to believe that the Soviet Union was paradise. And that's something that's all the more easy to believe about a place that's distant, that you haven't been to, that you can't speak the language, than it is about something closer to home. So I think they were generally not aware of this at all. So that's the end. Okay. Thank you very much.